right, 1 second. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ben Kelly, and along with Miriam Fine and Olga Palchik, we founded the Brookline Literacy Coalition in 2022. And that we've worked together for many years. We decided last year to make our partnership explicit and to hold regular conversations and presentations around literacy education and advocacy. So thank you everyone for joining. We've been really overwhelmed by the community response to our events this past year and really excited about all the possibilities as they've emerged. Tonight, we're really thrilled to have Kareem Weaver join us for this conversation. Kareem is an educator and literacy activist from California who is tremendously knowledgeable, insightful, and passionate about ensuring all kids learn to read well in our schools. He's co-founder and executive director of FULCRUM, or Full and Complete Reading is a universal mandate, which partners with stakeholders to improve reading results for students. He's the Oakland NAACP's second vice president and chair of its education committee, and his advocacy was featured in the film The Right to Read, which many of you may have attended at the beginning of the month when we had our showing at the Coolidge Corner Theater. So, Kareem, thank you so much for being here to talk with us, and I'm going to give it over to Miriam and Ola to lead this conversation with Kareem. We ask that everyone generally stay on mute and just drop your questions into the chat as we go, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. Thanks so much for being with us, Kareem. Really appreciate it. As Ben said, so put your questions in the chat as they come up, and we will do our best to monitor and pause and hopefully really make this a conversation. But I will kind of pose some broad questions for you, Kareem, to start. And the first question I want to ask you, because I'm not sure if everybody here knows about this person, this amazing teacher, but I'd like you to tell us who was Marva Collins, and what have you learned? What did you learn from her? And what can other teachers learn from her? But tell us a little bit about her and what you think some major takeaways are from her work.
Sure, I love this question. This is a good one. Well, she was a heroine of mine. She passed on just a few years ago. And she was one of the greatest educators this country has ever known. Marva Collins started off in Arkansas, then moved up to Chicago and started a school. She worked in the public school system, started her own school, and became known for really moving kids, for really serving all kids, kids with disabilities, learning differences, kids from all ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, you name it. She got them to read, she got them to write and do math, and she was phenomenal. Phenomenal. Her kids, there was a 60 Minutes special on her because the results were so amazing. They said, this can't be true. Too good to be true, they said. And so they went and they checked it out and they saw her doing things that most weren't doing. Now we call it the science of reading. Back then, they just called it good teaching or the Marva Collins way. And she just was a phenomenal, phenomenal educator. And then 60 Minutes came back 15 years later, 10 years later, however many years later, and saw those same children doing incredible things, clerks of the state's attorney's office, this and that. And it was so amazing that Ronald Reagan actually asked her to be his Secretary of Education. She declined. Wish she hadn't declined. But she is a luminary in the field and someone, this idea that all kids can read, for many it's a theory, for her it was a reality. And she went around the country providing professional development for educators in the later years of her career. And so she was able to really teach people her techniques, her methods. And she's just an exemplar. So sometimes when I get a little bit cynical and I get a little bit frustrated, I ask myself, what would Marva do? Because she was very clear that all kids means all kids. And she proved it. They can do it. They can read, they can learn, they can excel at high levels if we just give them what they need. So that's who she was. I welcome, invite anybody to look her up, Google her, look up her 60 Minutes special clips, because she's a phenomenal legend in the field. And it surprises me to this day that many of us have never heard of her in our education programs. I mean, we've heard of others, and there's professors with curricula out and this and that, but we've never heard of Marva Collins, who was one of the let's say just one of the great educators of our time.
Yeah, thanks, Kareem. I mean, I think you know, from what I've learned about her and in general thinking about this this literacy issue that we face and that we faced for a long time, where we have far too many kids who cannot read well at all. One thing from her I've seen is like, I mean, like you said, all means all, like the, you know, just high expectations. And how can teachers have those high expectations? Like what prevents other teachers from having those high expectations? And that's as a follow-up. And then also, if you could also, just to start, I mean, I know there's a lot of people here with a lot of, you know, coming from different places. If you could just frame very briefly this literacy issue that we are facing, and you know, just the science of reading movement and how that has been playing into it, and why literacy reading is a civil right to you. Miriam, but also sorry.
Miriam, listen, once I turn 50, it's one question at a time for me now.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Maybe 10 years ago, I would have followed all five. Was one at a time nowadays. Well,
I get it.
Let's start with the main takeaways from her. I'll start with the main takeaways from Marva. So one of the things that, the biggest takeaways, so oral language development matters. That's what Marva Collins did. I mean, she was doing Shakespearean plays and different things in the class, which was oral language development is what it was. And she really emphasized the basics and the fundamentals of linguistic development, written and oral language development. And, you know, she used open court curriculum. It was, you know, the earlier versions of open court, which taught me something, which is that it's not all about the curriculum, but the curriculum had to have the basics and the foundations set. Like you can't play around with the foundation. It's like building a house. You have a bad foundation, let a wind come and it's going to be a problem. And there are winds in our kids' lives all the time. Economic, familial, social. There are all kinds of winds nowadays, but you have to have a solid foundation. And then from there, the educator takes over and they breathe life into it. They color it. They know the children. But sometimes we spend so much time trying to make things, trying to make sure our curriculum is tailored to the kids. We forget that's actually the teacher's job. What we need from our curriculum is to give us the brass tacks, the nuts and bolts in a manageable way. We can actually impart it to the students, and then we breathe on it as educators. And somehow, some way that's gotten lost, and we think the curriculum's going to solve everything. It's not, but it has to solve the main thing, which is if you do this, the kids will learn to read. Now, I've got to, as a teacher, know my students and families and community, and I've got to connect with them however I need to make sure that happens. So that's the main thing. Okay, question number 2. What was your next question?
So the question number 2 was just to frame the issue, frame the challenges that we face with literacy, and why is reading a civil right? How is it a civil right? Why is it solvable?
Okay. Let me
that
go
kind
with
of
that.
thing. Background, yeah.
Right. So let me start with this. The biggest challenge we face in education is the fact that we don't perceive the challenge itself. It's kind of like when you I have a lot of relatives in the South, and as a kid, when I go visit, you know, when you get out the car, you step off the plane, all of a sudden you kind of gasp because the humidity just grips you, but you don't really realize it until you get off the plane. And you're like, what in the world is this? After a little while, you get used to it. No big deal. It's the same thing with methods around literacy. Most of us learn to read rather easily, especially those of us who are in education, you know, in the system. Things work for us. And so the methods that we've been using for the last 15, 20 years, depending on your district. Our default setting is what works for us, not realizing that the research consensus and the brain science actually shows the kids need it the way Marva Collins was doing, meaning systematic, step-by-step, explicit, direct instruction, ensuring a solid foundation, making sure it's oral language development and writing and all these things. But many of us, if we didn't need that, then our default setting isn't that. And so we think we're being kind and loving and supportive to do what worked for us, but when in reality, it's the opposite. What worked for us isn't what the majority of kids need. And so there's this disconnect. That's the biggest issue in education right now. That's why you show me a school board president and a superintendent who has a child with dyslexia, for example, or they may have it themselves, or maybe a sibling, and I'll show you somebody who gets it. Because they understand, wait a second, these children are smart. They're not like cast-offs or ne'er-do-wells. These are regular kids, just like my brother or my son or my daughter or what have you, or myself. And so they get it. But if you don't have that experience, if you're one of those who have this learning bias, which is the majority of us as educators, it's very, very difficult to perceive the challenge itself. So that's how to answer the question, that question. There's more to it, and I can expand if you like, but that's one of the biggest obstacles we face. But we don't talk about it. We'd rather talk about race, class. But don't get me wrong, all stuff matters, but we're addicted to race and class. There are books written about race and class. You don't see books written about learner's bias. But race, oh my goodness, it's on cable news, I'm sure, right now. It's in someone's newspaper right now. It's salacious, it's titillating, and there's truth to that, sure. I was at one point I was in a California State NAACP conference, their education committee, and the issue of critical race theory came up, which was, as you know, was a hot button issue at the time, and there's people falling either side of this thing, and I'm not going to get into all that, but I remember we had a big meeting about it. We were talking about it, and should we take a position? And I didn't say anything the whole meeting. At the end, they said, Kareem, what do you feel about critical race theory? You haven't said anything. I said, well, my position is that I want our children to be able to read the theory. That's the fullness of my position on this. And until they can read the theory, this is just us adults talking about what we think should matter most, but instead of looking at their most critical need. And we have to be disciplined with this. And I have my beliefs about it, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, like, kids can't read. Whatever else we've got going on, what other issues are on the table, and there are myriad issues. Some have legitimate, we all have our points of view and our politics and our perspectives, but doggone it, at the end of the day, the kids can't read. What are we doing about that? So that's my perspective. And I know it's not always popular to have that narrow view, but I find that narrow focus allows me to separate, the must-dos from the may-dos, the essential from the non-essential. And nowadays, we really do need that because there are lots of distractions out there.
Yeah. Kareem, what do you think? I mean, as an issue that, obviously cuts across, like you said, race, class, there are people who are affected by this and people in their families who are affected by, just not, the instruction that is, like you said, geared more towards those who just find it much easier to learn. Instead of making sure all kids get what they need. So it cuts across, and yet, like in our district in Brookline, I mean, we have disparities. I mean, you look at the data, you look at our state assessments, and we see long-standing disparities, right? And we've been having kind of a hard time getting people to, be a little up in arms about that. And, we have a question in the chat too, like somebody wants to ask you advice for colleagues as they begin working with their district's equity team to push this forward as a social justice issue. How can people understand that it is indeed a social justice issue?
Well, that's an important question, but and I'll address that. But first, let me just address something you said. Brookline is like many districts. So, for example, Beverly Hills, I don't know if you're familiar with Beverly Hills, the movie stars and actors live there in California. I think the Beverly Hills Hillbillies, if you all remember that. But about 72% of their third graders read proficiently. Now, I know there's some districts like my own here in Oakland and West Contra Costa that like they would kill for 72%. But if you really step back and think about it, that means with all the advantages that the community has, 1 in 4 of their third graders are reading. That's actually a crisis. And 1 in 4 of your kids can't read very well. That's a problem. And what we often think. So I say that because we kind of have to recalibrate. What are our expectations for kids? And we have to just be very, very explicit about this. Many times we look at the data and we say, and we compare our data to our neighboring district's data. But it's okay to ask the question, how good is good enough when it comes to our kids? What is the acceptable level of proficiency in your community? I just got to call the question, because it may be that there's some folks, even in Brookline, who say, 70% is all right. We're doing great. We're doing better than Boston or Cambridge or wherever, but what's your number? And we have to also recognize that many times green is the color of the day. We get tutoring for our kids. If our kids are struggling to read, it doesn't always come up in a PTA meeting because people are embarrassed, but they'll go get a private tutor. They'll get someone to support them with the foundation of reading and math. And so then they get tested by the school district, and their proficient reader in the district says, see, everything we're doing is working. Ask your school board to give the survey. How many of our parents in grades, let's say first, second grade, how many, or second grade, how many of you all are getting private tutoring for your kids? And how much does it cost? I'm not just ask. Very few people ask that question. Very few people want to know the answer to that question. Most districts where parents have means, that number's off the charts. Off the charts. And that's just parents deciding, I can't give up on my child. I mean, what else are you going to do? Your kid's struggling, and the school district and everyone acts like everything is okay. So it must be my kid, let me get them the private help. But in reality, every kid's got a right to a free and appropriate public education, according to the federal government. And we have to make sure that we're putting policies and practices into place to secure those rights. Because, I understand that there are disparities, but oftentimes what presents itself as a racial disparity, oftentimes an economic disparity. Those who have the money, they get it figured out. And then you layer on top of it our own stuff. So for example, most African-American students who end up with an IEP or going to special ed is for behavioral reasons. When they're getting diagnosed with learning differences much later, because the expectations in general are different. So the alarm bells don't go off at the same speed as other kids. And that means that kid is sitting in class for years, struggling, thinking they're dumb, not knowing what to do. Well, yeah, guess what? They're going to flip a chair. At some point, they're going to get hypersensitive. A lot of kids will, not all, but some. It's different girls and boys, data says. But nevertheless, we have to create a system where all kids are getting the support they need in a timely way. That means rather than relying on our own biases, our own understandings exclusively, that we also put systems and structures in place, like screening for dyslexia, which is a big thing, because once you do that, you get early data that you can adjust to, such as scheduled regular formative assessments and a comprehension data analysis system and the training and support, such as professional development for educators and parents, so that they understand how to help kids where they are. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but some of those differences, like I said, they play out around economic lines more than anything else. And so from a social justice perspective, now let me put on that's me with my FULCRUM hat. The FULCRUM stands for Full and Complete Reading as a Universal Mandate. But now let me put on my activist hat, this NAACP. From the NAACP perspective, this is a civil rights issue. I'll go one step beyond it. This is a human rights issue. Imagine for a second that you can't read, that you're completely illiterate, or that you're half illiterate, meaning you can kind of read the road signs, but little else. Just take a moment and think about the course of your day. Think about how you feel when you lose your job. What am I going to do? The insecurity that breeds. How does that impact your relationship? How does it impact your sense of security, your peace of mind? How does that impact your mental health? How does it impact your economic opportunity? Sometimes we get so used to the way things are, we got to step outside of our bubble and just, even if you don't have dyslexia, like just being on the razor's edge of literacy creates a certain level of insecurity that is difficult to shake. And it manifests in all kinds of ways. So from a social justice perspective, a civil rights perspective, this is the main thing. This isn't some side issue. This is the heart of the matter. Because without this, you don't have access to the political realm. You don't have access, limited access to the economic realm, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that 42% of self-made millionaires are dyslexic. 48% of incarcerated adults are dyslexic. My point is, you can go either way. It just depends on the kind of support you have. Do your parents have? I mean, so Brookline's got to decide as a community what the threshold is for access. How much money do you have to have so that you can be sure your kids will get what they need in the public school system? Should it just be, well, listen, if they're struggling, their parents got to have the money to take them to tutoring and figure it out, and that's just how we do it here. Like, okay, but let's be honest about it. Or you can say, kids that come through our school district in our cities, we're going to make sure they get what they need because it affects all of us. Like, that's just an ideological decision you have to make as a group. And you can't let the talking heads and all the politics and all the trash talk on Twitter cloud the issue. It's really an issue of community values. Do you value all kids, or is there an acceptable amount of loss? There was a last thing I'll say on this. There was a moderator on a Facebook chat group or Facebook group, and her name was Terry Beeler. Some of you may have seen this. And she moderated for Fountas and Pinnell, which is a curriculum. And I guess the science of reading people, especially the dyslexic moms, so dyslexic moms, no joke, they were really after, they're like, listen, we want this, we want that, you're not doing this. And finally, she just lost it. And she said, you know what? Enough. I'm going to cut you off, or I'm going to kick you out of the group. She said, I'm sick and tired of 20% of the population causing so much unrest. The system is working fine, but you guys are turning it all upside down for 20% of kids. Well, you can imagine how that went over. But I appreciate, and of course they sat her down, you can't moderate anymore and all that. But she said the quiet part out loud, which is everything's good. It's working for our bottom line. It's working for, these other constituencies. Why should we upset the apple cart for 20%? So 2 things. I don't know what your number is, not just the dyslexic students, but students who struggle to read or people who have to get tutoring and all the rest, whatever that number is. And then what I also don't know is your resolve. Like, what's okay for Brookline? And you got to answer that question before anything else. And if all kids is part of your DNA, then you have to make some moves. If it's not, if it's live and let live, then okay, but that's a community decision that has to be made.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate, I think we all appreciate you framing it that way, and that really resonates, because that's it. You have to make that decision. And I've heard that quiet part out loud, actually, in our community. I've heard that people say that type of thing. And it's hard to get the urgency, it's hard to get people to feel the urgency when their mindset, whether, conscious or not, is like that. And when the data, when the tutoring and stuff masks some of the data. So the numbers, they could argue are not that bad, right? So I think that question is really just absolutely key.
So, one last thing on that. I would say it's not hard to get people to care about their neighbors' children. It's not. But there has to be a level of honesty and vulnerability that precedes that. So I've been in PTA meetings. Nobody really wants to say their child is struggling. Nobody wants to say they're spending, $1,000 a month or $75, 4 times a week. Not like I've ever done it, right? I've done it too. Like, nobody really wants to announce that to me. Everyone wants to be okay. We want to contribute. And, hey, can you bake cookies? But at a certain point in time, we have to be willing to uncover our eyes and look squarely at the issue. And the issue is, right now, access to literacy is access to life in the modern age. It's access to the currency, the coin of the realm. But it depends on your own, as parents, your own pocketbook and your ability to supplement. The public system is our collective pocketbook. The public system is supposed to be the thing that equalizes. I'm not saying all kids are the same, they're not. But every kid should at least get a fair shot. At least start them off with the foundation. I mean, if we're not going to do that, then, then that means that when my wife's walking down the street late at night, then I shouldn't be surprised when some kid yells at her or throws something at her or tries to take her purse, because I've sown seeds of discord from the very beginning in that child's life. I'm not excusing bad behavior, but I'm saying we have to decide what kind of society we want to be. And every community is different. I speak to people just in the good news is, what I found as I speak to people is most folks are vulnerable to their best selves. Most people want to stand up for kids. Most people want that. Even if they have a different idea or philosophy or method of instruction or whatever, if you say, hey, what does the data say? What does the data say? Does the data say that our third graders, when we screen, what do we find? How are we certain? If you just ask clear questions, does that line up with our expectations? Does that line up with the research consensus in the brain science? And just go from there. Most people are open to that conversation, and it's really an important one to have.
Yeah. Well, so we have a question actually from one of our school committee members, so we call it school boards here, about well, it's a two-part thing, but and so I want to ask it, but if it's okay with everyone, I want to, before I ask that question, which involves more like the nitty-gritty of making change and what steps to take, I want to ask a little bit about the obstacles to change, because like you said, yes, okay, we can get people to realize the urgency to put the bar up here, right? To make a decision that all kids will learn to read well in our schools, and to make that main thing the main thing. Everything you said. So let's say we get that urgency, we get that understanding, right? But then there's still some obstacles. Well, I guess there's obstacles to creating that urgency, but there's also obstacles even when people can kind of agree about it. I mean, I've heard it framed with all these words that start with I, just as a mnemonic, like there's inertia, right? There's interests, there's ideology, right? I mean, we have this balanced literacy model entrenched in our schools, like for a long time, right? There's ignorance, maybe just people don't really understand how to teach reading, right? Or, so how do you see those obstacles playing out, like inertia, ideology, interests, and then there's implementation, right? Like even when, you make the decision, there's all kinds of challenges with implementation. Yeah. Do you see, what do you think about that?
So let's step back. This is what I think. I think, see, this is kind of what we do. We have meetings and conferences and forums and things, and we talk, and you're doing a great job, by the way. But I think it's important. To make sure we're centering the main thing, which is, I want folks who are listening to know there are school districts in our country where they're getting 90 to 95% of kids through. If you strip away everything else, maybe we can learn something from it. So I'm only talking about those districts. By the way, there's a podcast. I love it. I think it's season 6 now. Ed Trust has a podcast. It's called Ordinary Districts with Extraordinary Results, something like that.
Yeah, Karen Chenoweth. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That very few views. It's almost as if we just want the car crash. But I mean, they walk you through step by step how these districts turned it around. There's one at C for Delaware. I was just talking with a publisher whose curriculum they used the other day, whose curriculum they decided to use. I was talking to her the other day. And she's like, why isn't everybody banging down my door asking to use our curriculum? That's a whole other question. But from the second worst in the state to the second highest in the state, This is Seaford, Delaware. This is where lots of second language learners and kids coming from the Dominican Republic and Haiti, plants closing down, so there's lots of poverty, all the stuff. And they went from the bottom to the top. Nobody's interested. Nobody's interested. Now, ask me what the Kardashians are doing next week, and people can tell you. But ask them about what's happened to Seaford, it's crickets. Or Lane, Oklahoma, crickets. Crickets. Like, so what we're talking about, and most educators, see, before we go into the minutia, I just wanted, because as educators, it's tough. You don't hear examples of success. If you tell me, hey, look, there's some people that are doing it in the foothills of Appalachian, Kentucky, they're doing it. They're doing it in Oklahoma, and Delaware, and Texas, and all these places, in Montana. Most educators would say, really? What are they doing? Like, you know, as educators, you tell me, you show me something that's working, now you got my attention. The theory and the talk and all that, we've been talked to for years. These are places, and they walk you step by step how they did it, what the board did, what the parents did, what the superintendent did, the shifts they had to make. Some of it was not easy, how challenging it was to the messaging and the culture. And I see, these are some great questions in the chat, by the way. Great questions. Ola, I see your question or your comments about the data. Stephen, I love this idea. You know, the questions you asked about the best practices and what do you get started with? And what I would just say is culture. Culture beats program any day of the week. Any day of the week. And so you have to spark a culture of curiosity in your district. There are certain assumptions that have hardened in most systems, just like in most communities, families, institutions. You got to get able to knock them off their pivot foot. You have to be able to get curiosity back in the building, have a season of exploration. That means doing things like, we're going to sponsor some professional development for anybody who wants it. We got to get the knowledge in the building, and not just the super, you know, dense graduate level stuff, but the 2-hour class on the weekend stuff, like different, because people can opt in where they are. Stuff for parents, stuff. You have to get the conversation started in the building. Otherwise, it's just a mandate. And I can tell you, these uniform mandates, when the culture's not established, good luck with that. So but that takes leadership, board leadership, parent leadership, superintendent and chief academic officer leadership. There's a room for everyone on this train. Leadership isn't about your title. It's about your ability to move people to do things that they don't have to do. And so that's what Brookline and like any other district really, really needs. One, you got to establish that sense of what's possible by exploring and doing the research about what's working elsewhere and what did they do. Secondly, you got to establish a sense of curiosity and wonder and the beginnings of conversation inside buildings. That means, you know, we just had this COVID money, you know, people were flush with cash, right? For the COVID years, that's almost done, but why not use some of that money for professional development? Why not use some of that money to and I'm talking about the curriculum. Yes, curriculum matters, absolutely matters. But if you just put a new curriculum in teachers' hands, most of the time, like, we do what we do. Like, we'll pick and choose what we want, and teachers are human beings. You have to give people the opportunity to build their own knowledge and their own practice first, and then provide them the tools that they can then leverage their knowledge and expertise. Curriculum is important, but first thing first is culture. So anyway, and then there's some simple things that you can do. Does the superintendent have literacy as part of the work plan? Does the board have literacy as a regular standing item on their agenda? Or the PTA? Or, you know, how big of a deal is this to your community? And there will be roadblocks. We said, well, we don't have that money. You know, we spend all our COVID money on whatever, new basketball gym or whatever. Okay, this is where the community comes in. This is where philanthropy comes in the business community, because guess what? Businesses are desperate to get kids reading. Desperate. That's the talent pool. And the business community looks at this and says, wait a second, we've got kids coming in here applying for jobs for reading at a 9th grade reading level. We're trying to compete with international companies. This is a problem. Or our military, our kids can't pass the AFSAD test. So we've got a recruitment issue. So there are lots of institutions that really are impacted by the fact that kids aren't reading, none the least of which is our families and the security that our kids and our families feel because of this issue going forward.
Kareem, do you think those kinds of changes can happen without, Emily Hanford Sold a Story podcast. The last episode was called The Reckoning.
Mhm.
And, Brookline has been, really committed to this balanced literacy model. There was literacy collaborative with Lesley University across the river, coaches, and it's all been embedded, the assessments, everything. Does there need to be some sort of reckoning before these changes can happen, or can people just sort of pretend like that never happened and then move on and make changes?
Most school systems take the latter approach. People just make shifts and figure that nobody, keeps a record. No one keeps keeps the roll. But I can tell you, if you're serious about getting buy-in, if you're serious about getting, and I love Emily, I know her well, we're friends, we speak together, but I haven't heard her last 2 updated episodes. I look forward to hearing it. But what I have said often is that there has to be some sort of ownership of what has happened. Somebody has got to take responsibility. And if that doesn't happen, it falls on teachers, and that's a problem. You can't have it fall on teachers. Teachers are doing what they've been trained to do and what they're paid to do by the school system, meaning they're a designee of the superintendent. That's it. That's their official title. They're a designee. And the superintendent designates for them what to do. So they're following instructions. Their universities have taught them a certain way. The school district designates them to do certain things in terms of implementation, the board policy a certain way. And so but then they're the ones that get the blame. Come on now, let's be real about this stuff. We have to take some ownership of this. That means somebody in positional leadership has to step up and say, I blew it. We blew it. We made some mistakes. Now, that is one of the biggest barriers to change, because nobody in leadership really wants to do that. It's hard. It's hard. And how am I, as a chief academic officer, going to keep my job if I admit that I led this charge towards something that was anti-science, doesn't work, et cetera, because I'm supposed to be the head knower. But what they don't understand oftentimes is that people don't come after them with pitchforks when they're vulnerable and honest. They come after them with the pitchforks when they feel like they're being invaded, disingenuous, and when they try to make parents feel like they're crazy. Like, why are you, like, this is great. Look at our percentages. Look at our test scores. Like, maybe your kid's the problem. Like, when you try to gaslight parents, feel like, okay, now it's war, right? So if you really want to get this thing right, you've got to have people in leadership who are vulnerable enough to say, hey, we made some mistakes, and I'm going to learn with you. I'm going to lead. I'm not just going to sit back in my chair while you all do everything. I'm on this journey with you. I'm going to be the head learner. That includes principals and assistant principals. That includes grade level chairs and superintendents and chief academic officers and instructional leadership team. Like, there has to be a season of learning and a season of grace. Without that, it becomes all out war. And there can be progress made in that, but it's going to be bloody and it's going to be messy. And the kids usually, they may start off in the middle, but pretty soon it becomes about adult stuff, who wins and who loses and all that. If you want to keep kids in the center, you have to have a season of learning first and a season of grace. As long as people are honest and straightforward and vulnerable, like, that matters more than your title of doctor or master's or whatever. If you don't have the character to state, you know what, we made some mistakes, like a lot of the sector did, but we're not going to give up on kids. This is our belief that all kids can learn. And so we're going to do what it takes to learn together, and we're going to lead the way. That's your credential. Your vulnerability in your leadership is your credential, not the certificate on your wall or whatever the university said. So I would just say that's our biggest challenge, is finding people who can lead with that mindset, as opposed to oftentimes, unfortunately, what we find in our systems.
Yeah. Kareem, one question that is in the chat from Jennifer, that, given all of what you're describing takes a significant amount of time. All of this is important and necessary and complex, and and the time is needed to do it.
Yep.
But she asks, do you see any immediate measures that can help move the needle in the short term?
Yeah.
So yeah,
a few things. Here you go. So this will cost your district, $300,000-$400,000. You need a team of teachers, put them on sabbatical, and have them go around the country and see examples of success. 3 or 4 teachers, right? Not just the veteran teachers, you need a rookie too. So because what works for veterans might not work for rookies. So they need to go see it. Otherwise, people think you're just talking in like hyperbole, right? Let them go see it. And I know, it can be tough, but what better benefit to a system and an organization community can there be to people coming back saying, oh my gosh, guess what I saw? Let me show you the video. People need to hear that from their colleagues, whom they have trust and faith in. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, what you can do right now. I mentioned one of them, on-demand professional development in the science of reading at various levels, a menu of options that people can access. Right? It should be paid for by the state, but if it's not, then hey, county or the local district, that's got to happen. Right? You got to get that knowledge in the building. The third thing, you need a curriculum review committee, even out of sequence. So usually districts have an adoption process that's every 5 years or so. If you're going to do it right, take your time. That committee should be starting well in advance. Not a 3-month process. It should take time because publishers understand how strapped for time districts are. They know you really don't read the research. They know you really don't. Maybe you look at a brochure, maybe you flip through a few pages and see if it looks good. You got to do a deeper level of diligence than that. Another thing is, and these are like concrete things you can do. So a curriculum review, having a team to go around and look at towards the success. And also, here's another big one. So are there teachers, it could be principals, so mainly teachers, are there folks in your district who probably secretly are already leveraging the science of reading, are already getting great results for kids using those methods? You need to get them a platform. You need to video, interviewed, and all the rest. Then you have parents. So, and I see your comment, Liza. Parents have to be engaged and empowered. You need to have a skill-based scope and sequence where parents know what's being taught and when, for the most part. There could be variance within a week or so, fine, but they have a clue of what's going on in the classroom. This is the post-Zoom era. So not only do they have a right to know, they kind of want to know. So they can ask informed questions. When are we doing X, Y, and Z? When are we going to learn this diphthong? When are we going to learn this vowel combination? So they can actually have informed conversation and do more than just, no offense to cookie bakers, but it's not just baking cookies. They can get in there and ask some nuts and bolts questions about instruction. So those are some, and one last thing, there's a lot of things, but you got to systematically make sure your things are aligned. For example, if you pick a curriculum that's aligned with science reading, great, wonderful. But now tell me about the prep time your teachers have. Is it aligned to how much time it takes to actually prepare for these? I want teachers who are prepared. And I don't want them to prepare like it's the Goodwill or Salvation Army, like out of altruism. I want it to be a structural thing. So the preparation time in your teacher contract should be aligned to the preparation time required to fully implement whatever your reading curriculum is. Understanding that it's also got reading and math and science and all the rest. But if you tell me your prep time is 150 to 200 minutes a week, but this thing takes 2 hours a day to prep for, we got a problem. So those are some basic things that really should be done. And again, like I said earlier, make sure literacy is part of the superintendent's work plan or evaluation plan. Those are some things right now that can be done to get things on the front burner instead of the back burner. And I'm going really fast. I apologize. But I know you got a lot of stuff.
No, it's super helpful. And we, it's all good. It's really helpful.
This is not a mandate situation. While you're looking for the next question, this is not a mandate. This is not a top-down thing. I understand. Like those of you in charge, it's like, oh my God, I just tell them what to do and they do it. Right. Okay. Good luck with that. This is one of those things that if you don't get buy-in, it's a losing effort. And the only way you get buy-in, well, there are a few ways, but you have to meet people where they are. That's the call for leadership. How can you get people from where they are to where they need to be? And that's really the mandate of leadership. And, just passing a policy or adopting a curriculum that's not enough. It's not enough. You have to do the adaptive work to get the people to move and to have them explore. And it's going to be messy. You have to be willing to have some robust debates and some disagreements. That's healthy. You want that on the front end instead of the back end when they're supposed to be doing something else. They never have the debates, and so they refuse to do it. engage them up front. And if that takes a year or 2 years, so be it. But you go together.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just absorbing it all. Got a minute to absorb it all. Yeah, I think that's that's the thing, is like squaring that circle of like the urgency and the need for not just like, okay, fine, we got to do something, they're bothering us, everybody's saying we got to do something, the pressure's there, the momentum that is there, the signs of reading movement, the media reports, we got to do something, and then things are done not in the way that you're describing, with all the messy adaptive work that you need to be successful, and rather just kind of like checking some boxes and making it look good.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like that circle needs to be squared somehow, right?
Yeah, there's the bureaucratic. So this is not the time for a bureaucrat. You got the checklist and you run down, I did this. No. Most of these issues, there's an old phrase when a person tells their parents that, hey, you know what, I'm actually homosexual, or I'm this from that. The old phrase, coming out the closet. You got a lot of parents who are kind of in the closet. They don't really say what's going on. I don't care what the data says. Actually, I do care what the data says, but people are not in a rush to talk about this, and they're on their own journey. And they have to be, it takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of courage to stand up at a PTA and say, you know what, my kid struggles to read. My kid has got some issues. Nobody wants to do that. They just don't. Okay, we're human beings. And so how do you get people to step out of their comfort zone and be vulnerable? That's really the call for leadership. You have to model vulnerability, which is hard for people to do, but it's so necessary. And there's the gender stereotype that, okay, women can model vulnerability, but guys got to be tough, or whatever your framing of that is. Maybe the women are the ones modeling toughness, and the guys are. This is an everybody thing: male, female, rookies, veterans, chief academic officers, parents, everybody. Everybody has got to be willing to look at their practice, or look at their advocacy, or look at their whatever their lens is, and say, do I believe kids can learn or not? And if the answer to that is yes, then why do we have so many who aren't, or are with the help of additional support from home? What's that about? And am I really willing to explore? And am I courageous enough to follow what I find? That's it. Am I courageous enough? It helps when you don't have to go by yourself, because it is daunting when you go by yourself, especially as a teacher. The policies say this, your principal says this, your neighbors say that, like you're on an island. It helps to have parent groups being supportive, the board. It helps to have community groups like the NAACP and others. I mean, FULCRUM is a nonprofit we started out here in Oakland to really support with literacy. So what are the groups out there? What are the groups in your area that can provide coverage support? You saw the movie, some of you that we did. Well, that teacher was very, very vulnerable. Like, what if she was found out that she was doing something different? She didn't even have tenure. She could have been fired. So you're talking about real life fears that people have. That's why it's so important to go together. And not just parents and teachers, but also the ethnic groups. Because each ethnic groups and each stakeholder brings its own flavor to the mix, its own point of advocacy. You got to go together. When the board hears, okay, here come the bilingual parents. Okay, here comes the white parents. Here comes the Black parents. Here comes this group. Here comes that. And they're coming together. Oh my God. That's a whole different conversation than one particular group coming and say, oh, well, you should go to the committee on so-and-so that we have on Tuesdays, every third Tuesday of the month. Like, that's what you do when people come along. But when they come together, like, oh my God, I got to deal with this. What is this about? That's what you want to do. But to do that, you have to go together. So the biggest question, Miriam, is, do you all have the fortitude in Brookline to go together? Do you get along enough with all the different constituencies to have a common agenda and go together to present that agenda to the board? Do the Black parents and the white parents and the bilingual, do they get along enough to center literacy and make it the core of their advocacy? And listen, they can argue about everything else, and I don't know the answer to that. Only you guys do. But do the adults have the discipline, the humility, and the ability to dialogue enough? You know, can you do it? Because if you can't do that, I'm not. It's going to take at best. It's going to take a lot longer, but more likely it's not going to happen because you get picked off one at a time, and you got to get the whole district on board. And to do that, you have to go together. That includes your labor association. You know, that includes all these different stakeholders who have a role in this. Go together and take the time to do that on the front end rather than chase it on the back end.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful, especially, you know, for us that, as Ben said in the beginning, you know, we just kind of formalized this, our little coalition here this year, and we've been doing a lot to increase awareness and have these discussions. But, you know, in thinking about next steps, and like Liza said in the chat, like, you know, what's the message? Who are the messengers? What's the message? Like, that is really that's key for us to think about.
You cannot delegate the message. You can't wait for some appointed person to come descend from there. Martin Luther King ain't coming for this. It's you. That's what my co-founder Liza and I decided. You know, we're sitting around at the breakfast table eating our little thing. We're like, you know, we should start an organization to do this. We both have kids who are dyslexic. I didn't know that at the time. Actually, I didn't know. But we're like, we can't wait on somebody else to solve this problem. There's no help coming, Brookline. There's no help coming. Like, what you see is what you get. You know, if change were coming, it would have happened by now. You have to push. You have to let the board and the staff know this is our priority as a community. And as I've said to the folks out in Oakland, look, we want basically two things above all else. One, we want safety. I don't want to turn on the news and hear about, you know, some disaster. I don't want that. Like, I want my kid to come home safely, so like I send them to school safely. That's one. Two, I want them to be able to read and read to understand. I don't, you know, your ideology and philosophy, you know, all that. You know what? I just want them to know how to read so they understand and so that they can chart their own course. Everything else after that we can talk about. We can debate in good faith, fine. But those two things have got to be non-negotiable. And if they are, you will find common cause with folks throughout the district. Just like Liza and I found common cause. We've been going at it ever since I've been open. People around the country doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, we are just so grateful for all your work out in Oakland and spreading the word all over, and just helping out all of these various groups and people who are trying to do this. And we're so also so proud that we're so happy that Liza and Carrie are here too, and that there's this Brookline, this really cool Brookline connection, you know, with some family members in town. Do we have any last minute? We only have a couple more minutes. Any last minute questions from anyone? Oops, I think I see one.
While you're digging up that question, let me just answer Jennifer Pressy's question about, like, in meeting with staff, like, what's the right thing? I'm going to put something in the chat. These are the 10 questions we started off with when I had advocacy meetings. This is before FULCRUM was founded. This was NAACP work. And just like, I started off by asking these questions to the board, the superintendent, to open up the conversation about literacy. Just get them to answer these questions, then you can go from there. Okay. All right, Miriam, you're on. Sorry about that.
No, that's good, because that was the I wanted to bring that question. You're great at monitoring the chat. Wow,
that's some good stuff in the chat. The chat is on fire right now. It's
yeah.
Miriam, I'm just sticking in the chat our website, which is very bare bones right now, actually, because we have just gone through strategic planning. But if you know, it is there, and there's some good resources on the resource page, as well as the link to the Extraordinary Districts podcast that Kareem mentioned earlier, and the Right to Read film, in case anyone wants to organize another screening in your community.
And there was also a
Excellent.
question around the equity team that you all have. So equity, how would you start working with the district equity team to push this forward as a social justice issue? Curriculum audits, that's part of it. Surveys to parents, to find out how much money is being spent on tutoring, et cetera, and the percentage of parents, that's equity issues. Somebody's got to ask those questions. And by the way, curriculum is also equity. Professional development for teachers is also equity. It's just a matter of having equitable access to something, but you got to get to the bottom of some of these things so that when you start this journey, it's an informed start, as opposed to people just guessing here and there. And then also, another thing, quick, I can squeeze in, it's okay to have teams of people explore different seasons of that podcast and say, what did you learn in season 1? What are the examples of success in season 2? And what did they do? Come back, do a root cause analysis and see where there is an overlap, because you've got the Venn diagrams going and say, oh, they all did these 7 things. Guess what? We're going to start doing these 7 things. Like, some of that is just common sense. You could also look at the American Federation of Teachers website and see, they have the elements of an effective reading program listed. It's right there, and they're spot on. So there are good places, concrete places where you can start this journey collectively.
Excellent. Yeah, lots of work to do, lots of great guidance on how to keep doing it. So we really, really appreciate it. We are, and thanks for putting all those links in the chat, Liza, and yeah, we are going to definitely save the chat, and we have a newsletter that we send out, and we'll send the recording as well as all these resources for people to follow up on, for sure. So what can I say? Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was
pleasure.
terrific. So much
Thank
food
you
for
all.
thought. Thanks for coming, everyone. Really appreciate it. Onward.
Onward. All right. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Thank you, Kareem.
My pleasure.